Okay. Okay. So, good morning, guys. Thank you. Thanks you for the worship. We've got a kind of an interesting morning. This I've got you for two sessions today, which is nice. So today we're going to talk about something that is kind of very much present in the world. It gets into a lot of kind of current kind of situations, particularly in Israel. And so the talk that I kind of put together for you is based on the war in Gaza and what's going on in Israel, and what the reason why we're doing this is just because it's so kind of present and common in our world. There's a lot on social media, there's a lot on college campuses, on high school campuses. There's just a lot in the world that is connected to what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now. And this is to give you an orientation to what's happening. Most of us as Christians have a pretty good handle on like the history of Israel in the Bible, right? We kind of understand like the judges and then the kings and then the exile and then the return to the land, and even in the first century like the Romans and the Greeks. But then things get a little fuzzy for most people between like the year 30 AD and like 1950. Like nobody really knows what happened in the middle. So there's a lot that happened in the middle. And one of the things that within the land of Israel that's helpful is that the most recent kind of large kingdom that that oversaw this area was a group that was called the Ottomans. The Ottomans were in Turkey, and they had for about 500 years an empire, and that empire collapsed at World War One. Okay, so what we're going to look at is from the collapse of World War One forward. So just a couple of things. What I'm going to do for you is give you kind of three orientations to what's going on. I'm not sure we're going to get to all three of these, but there's a historical, there's a narrative, and then there's kind of an interpersonal way of thinking about this. So historical, just looking at what happened to kind of create the situation that exists today. A narrative is just about like what are some of the questions, and how do we approach them, and then finally how do we engage, and we might not get to that last one, um, but that's okay. But what are we not doing? So we're not proposing a solution to the war in Gaza. We are not armchair quarterbacks here. No government is calling Joshua Wilderness that's sort of saying, "Oh, what should we do?" That's not what's happening here. So we're not really getting into that. That's not exactly what's happening. Also, this isn't a debate. So we're not looking to try and say, okay, what's this side say and what's this side say? And, you know, within the kind of modern political environment, these debates are very popular and common, but they're not always very productive. And so that's not kind of what's happening. We're also not trying to carve out a single opinion that everybody has to have. You don't need to agree with me on some of the way that I'm laying this out. But what the idea is to give you some handles on how to navigate through a very complex set of questions, and it's important that we do. We are as followers of Jesus, we need to be connected to the Bible, but we also need to be connected to the world around us. We can't just sort of bury our heads in the scripture. And so that's not really going to work in the modern world. We're also not keeping up with every political development, so I'm not going to talk about what happened this week. So it's that kind of stuff, okay? And we're not going to answer all your questions. Sorry. So, historical orientation to Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, okay? That sounds like some heavy duty kind of stuff, but these are two really important kind of terms and ideas that you need to know to go forward. Now, I'm going to go for a while and then I'm going to pause, okay? So it's a lot of information, but it's helpful for me to get through at least some of it, and then we'll pause for some questions, and then we'll kind of go, and we'll see how far we get, all right? All right, so there's two people. These two guys are very important characters in the story of modern Israel and modern Palestine, okay? The guy on the left is a man named Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a Jewish guy from Austria who was a fairly secular Jewish man. He was a reporter initially who was reporting on various things and reported on a case in Europe, in France, where not a general, but an officer in the French army was accused of selling secrets to Germany, which were France and Germany were the kind of enemies. And he was a loyal French citizen. He served in the army. There was no evidence against him, and yet he was sentenced and he was convicted and he was sent to prison for no other reason than he was Jewish. And so this case and Theodor Herzl began a conversation in Europe about a Jewish homeland. And Zionism is a movement to create a Jewish homeland for Jewish people where Jewish people would be safe. Here is a definition. Zionism is a movement for the self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. The goal of Zionism is safety. It always has been. And so Jews around the world, and in Europe in particular, were never safe. They were never really French. They were never really German. They were never really Russian. They were always Jews. So they were always separate. And this was continually a question. So the goal was safety for Jews from bigotry, violence, and anti-Semitism. There was no idea that going to the land of Israel was the fulfillment of a biblical promise. So Christian Zionism is connected to the idea that Jews have a place in this land and it's part of God's promise, but Zionism was never that. It was just for safety. And so and he began in the late 1800s, 1880 to 1885. The movement of Zionism started, and over the subsequent years, Jews became kind of divided over it. They argued over it. Some loved it, and there were waves of immigration, primarily from Europe, into Israel, and we'll talk about that. It wasn't Israel yet, but it was into that time. So the guy on the right is his last name is Al-Husseini, and he was the Mufti of Jerusalem. So a Mufti is kind of like a bishop in the church world, okay? So he's Muslim, but he's not like a cleric. He's kind of a little higher than that. He's sort of over the area. And so he is one of probably the most articulate voices in what would be called Palestinian nationalism. So what is this? It's a national movement of the Palestinian people that espouses self-determination and sovereignty over the region of Palestine. It was a subset of Arab nationalism that existed during the same time as Zionism, the late 1800s, early 1900s, It was primarily centered in either Damascus, Syria, or Egypt. And there was a number of different kind of versions of this, but Arab nationalism was a similar kind of a movement of self-determination for these areas. The goal of Palestinian nationalism was the transfer of land to Arab Palestinian control, a majority population of Palestinian Arabs within the current borders of Israel, and the complete eradication of the state of Israel. So that was the stated goal of Palestinian nationalism. And so the phrase "from the river to the sea," if you've heard that phrase, so what that means, the river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean Sea, but from the river to the sea means that that area would be a Palestinian Arab Muslim state. And therefore, Israel would not exist. So baked into the comment, or baked into the idea from the river to the sea, is that Israel doesn't exist. It would be a place where Jews didn't live. So Israel could exist somewhere else, just not there. Palestinian nationalism was neither Ottoman nor Egyptian. It was formed largely in response to the British and French, particularly the British colonial kind of presence in the Middle East. The word Palestinian was first used in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but became identified with a specific group of people, especially in the 1920s. And it's not an illegitimate word, it's just a modern word. It's similar to Lebanese. Lebanese wasn't a word that was used for much of history either. But as these countries kind of developed, the words became a definition for the people in those areas. And Palestinian nationalism was tied to kind of paramilitary movements from its inception. So, that's a lot. Let me just stop there for a second. Questions? Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to get there in a minute with a map, because it's easier to see on a map what happened. Yeah, I'll get there in a second. So Palestine is a name that went all the way back to the Roman Empire, and during the Ottoman control, this area would have been called, it was called various names. Sometimes it was called Syria, sometimes it was called Greater Syria, sometimes it was called the Levant. But the area that would be today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria was all kind of one area. And there were definitely different groups, but the Ottomans kind of considered it one large area, often called Syria. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know the word like Palestine and Philistine are connected, but modern Palestinians aren't direct descendants of Philistines. Can you kind of explain like that lineage?
Yeah, it's kind of a weak connection, those two linguistically, those two terms. It kind of makes sense because they sound a little similar, but the word Palestinian is more of a modern word connected to Arabs living or who have kind of a historical connection to that land. So it's not so Palestinian isn't so much a word that could go back, even though there were people there, but it's more of a modern word. Mhm.
What time period did you say this all was happening?
So this is all happening right around. Well, you'll see that everything really starts happening in about 1910. So it's not that long ago. Yeah. hmm But the beginnings of these movements were happening in the late 1800s. So you have this movement of Arab nationalism, of Zionism, that are kind of all moving at the same time. hmm
During the Ottoman Empire, was it like a melting pot between Jewish and Palestinians?
No.
No,
They lived near each other.
they lived near each other.
Yeah, for sure.
There's like borders and whatnot.
Well, let me show you the next slide. So this slide shows the Ottoman Empire, and the yellow part is when the First World War was being fought. The yellow part is what was the Ottoman Empire. But at one point, the Ottoman Empire was all of the colored portions. So the Ottoman Empire was a big, big deal for a long time, for like hundreds of years. So the Ottomans kind of controlled that whole area, which is yellow. And so in it, there were local leaders, and particularly if they weren't Turkish, they sort of gave local autonomy to different groups. So there were Jews and Arabs living in this entire area. So Damascus had a big Jewish community. Baghdad had hundreds of thousands of Jews. That's where my family's from. Yeah. Okay? You had a question?
Maybe we'll talk about it later, but I remember reading something a while ago about when Israel becomes a state, and I think it's like 1948.
Mm-hmm.
There was some crazy stuff that I read about their basically this like cult believing that this guy who made Israel become that state was like the Messiah. Have you heard about that?
Let me go through that, because what I'm going to do now is take us through from the end of World War I up through 1948, and you'll see there's a lot of things that happened during this time. Okay, so this area in yellow is where what the Ottoman control of the Middle East was like during World War I. Okay, and World War I was a war that was fought, among other things, against the Ottomans. And so the Ottoman Empire ended at World War I. And so what you had was a challenge, because the armies of Germany and France and Austria were fighting against the Ottomans. But if you look at the map, you're only fighting one direction. What you need is people who are on your side, on the other side of the Ottomans fighting against, okay? So there was an area that was considered the Arab Kingdom of Syria, or Greater Syria, sometimes just called Syria. The Levant, this is another name for this area. And so this whole area was not Turkish. And it's hard to understand this sometimes, but Turks and Arabs are different. And so the Turks didn't really like the Arabs, and the Arabs didn't really like the Turks, but the Turks were in charge. So there was some resentment. And so what happened is that the British and the French made a deal with the Arabs in this area. And they said, if you fight with us against the British and the French, if you fight with us against the Ottomans, we will give you this whole area. This will be your reward. Okay? So they said, sounded pretty good. They fought against the Ottomans. The Ottomans lost in World War I. And then what happened? This. The British and the French had absolutely no intention on giving them 1 ounce of that land. And this is what happened after World War I. It's called the Sykes-Picot Proposal. Sykes is a British guy, Picot is a French guy, and they literally were in like a smoky back room, and they took a map and they drew a straight line, and the French got north of the line and the British got south of the line. And that is for real what happened. This long line, that line, which is Syria, is above it, and below it is Jordan and Iraq. That line is still there. So the border of Syria today goes back to this proposal in 1916. There's no river, there's no mountain range. there's just like a straight line on a map. And if you ever see a straight line on a map that's like 500 miles long, the only reason why it's there is that somebody in a room took a ruler and just went, whoop, you get that side, I get this side. That's the only way that happens. Normal borders follow a mountain or an ocean or a river or something like that, okay? So this is what happens. Now, you can imagine how the Arabs in that area felt. And they felt as if that whole land was promised to them and they got it stolen from them. And this is the beginnings of a lot of the resentment that Arabs in the Middle East feel today. And it goes back to this kind of bad deal. Okay? Now I'm going fast. Like people write whole books about each one of these things, but and so you see where Israel is. Israel is kind of in the part of the British section, but then there was like also an international area that got kind of taken away fairly fast. So what happens now is after World War I, the question is what happens with the Ottoman areas? And particularly, there were other areas where Russia had like colonies in the Middle East. What happens to those areas? So, before the United Nations, there was this thing called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations said, we are going to set up what are called mandate governments. And mandate governments were these temporary governments to create self-governing countries, okay? And there were 14 of them. And there was the British mandate covered both of those areas, all of what is Israel and all of what today is Jordan in 1920. So the British mandate was both of those two. The Jordanian government didn't like that and actually was very successful in arguing that the British mandate should only be over Palestine and not what was then called Transjordan. Today it's just Jordan. And so in 1921, there were two countries that were kind of, not countries, but two mandate governments that were established. One was Palestine, one was Transjordan. And from 1921, the British were over Palestine. And the British controlled Palestine and Transjordan until 1948. 1948 is when the mandate governments ran out. There was like a contract kind of a thing. Okay? Now, before that, there was a declaration in England that said that the government of England was favorable toward the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. They didn't exactly say where it was, but that was a kind of a statement that was very important for the foundation of Israel. It's called the Balfour Declaration. There was the British mandate, and these mandate governments were all over the Middle East. And you can imagine that, oh, and then I should show this. Okay, so this now is how the British mandate, no, sorry, went too fast. So over this time, you can imagine into the 20s that the Arab population of Palestine was not happy, because now all of a sudden, not only did they not get what they were promised, but they got the British, who were far more interested in the resources that were able to be kind of gotten out of these areas than they were in establishing any independent states. The French, the same. Oil is discovered in the Middle East, incredible resources, and so they weren't so eager to give this land over. At the same time, there were waves of immigration from Europe through the efforts of Zionism that Jewish people were coming into, at that point, Palestine, and mandate Palestine. And so during this time, there are all kinds of like battles and there's all kinds of kind of conflicts during this time between the Jewish settlers and the British, the Jewish settlers and the Arabs and the British. I mean, everybody's fighting with each other during this time. And the British are there that are just trying to kind of like say, well, we're just managing, we're the good guys. But they were not the good guys. And so they really were there to get the resources that they wanted out of the land. And so out of this period of time, the Jewish population from 1918 until, let's say, 1936 went from about 10% to 40%. And so the population really grew, particularly of Jewish people in this area. A group called, that you might have heard, the Muslim Brotherhood, was founded and developed during this time, which was kind of a radical version of the Arab nationalists that combined a very sort of radical religious identity as well. Hamas, the Taliban, ISIS, the government in Iran are all part of the kind of Muslim Brotherhood. They're related to that ideologically. And in Europe, the Holocaust is starting. And that's an important part of this whole story, is that by 1936, the Nazis are in power in Germany, and they're beginning to talk about and think about creating what they would call in German Judenfried, a land free of Jews. Because what the Nazis thought was, as long as Jews are present in the world around you, there is a problem. Jews were like a virus. And so they're the ones that cause you to be sick. So to not be sick, you have to get rid of them. So all this is going on at the same time, okay? So here now, this is the end of the mandate period. There's a plan for a partition, and this was the plan. And it was in 1947, and the mandate period is ending, and so there was a plan to partition British mandate Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The two-state solution was all the way back at the beginning there was this plan. And so the Arab state is in red, the Jewish state is in kind of grayish, and then Jerusalem would be this international zone. Who liked this plan? Nobody. No, none of the Jews, none of the Arabs liked this plan. Nobody liked this plan. However, there was a willingness by some to accept this, but those that were part of what was called the Muslim Brotherhood group, the more radicalized Arab group, rejected this. Why? Because the idea was that this is an area that should be primarily Arab in population, that should be Muslim in religion, and should be governed completely by an Arab Muslim national government. So, in 1948, Israel, in 1948, this plan is approved in the UN. The Jewish Israelis accepted it. The Arab nationalists didn't. And within an hour, the War of Independence starts. And they fought from 1948 in May until 1949. And what ended up happening was on the right. So the Gaza Strip was established, but it was managed by Egypt. The West Bank was established, but it was managed by Jordan. The people in each of these areas were not given Egyptian or Jordanian citizenship, but the countries of Jordan and Egypt managed these areas. The Arab population living inside of Israel, which would not include the West Bank and Gaza, were given Israeli citizenship. And today there are about 2 million Arab citizens in Israel, about 20% of the population. And so this is the beginning of the modern state of Israel. For Palestinians, this is what's known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. This was, in a similar way, for Palestinians, this is how Jews think about the Holocaust. A land and a people, and it just kind of taken away from them. And so this became now the beginning of what is now modern Israel. It's a very short story, but that's what we've got. Pause there for another question or two. Okay. So leading up to 1947, there was a lot of skirmishes. There was a lot of fighting. But here on the left, this is in 1948. The UN votes on this plan. Then by 1949, this is where there's like an armistice, a truce. Do you see one big difference, by the way? What's the big difference in those maps? Sort of, yeah, but look at the shapes. What's the big difference? There's one glaring difference. Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is no longer an international zone, but Jerusalem becomes divided. Half of it is in the West Bank and half of it is in Israel. And most of the War of Independence is fought in that little triangle there to have Jerusalem be the capital. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there were definitely allies on both sides, different countries fighting. There were, I mean, the United States was very involved. Egypt was very involved. Syria, Jordan were very involved. Yeah. hmm England was very involved. Although Britain, I mean, Britain just did so many bad things and wrong things during this. It just is staggering to like look at. But they had some individuals that I think were good, but by and large the British were not a positive force here. Okay, so all right, let me just ask a question, Jen. It's what time is it now? It's 10:20, right? We're gonna need to. I have 10:45. Okay, good. All right. So let me talk about now what happens next. What happens next, and what we're doing is we're looking at the context for the current war in Gaza. So what I'm going to do is talk about now the conflicts in Israel that have been going on from 1948 until now. Okay? So in starting in 1948 there is in 1947 there's a war of independence, 1948 to 49. This becomes basically the borders of Israel until 1967. And in 1967 there were 3 wars fought. One in 1967, one in 1973, and one in 1982. So the wars in Israel were between the neighboring countries and Israel, because the neighboring countries did not want Israel to exist. And so in 1967, the neighboring countries, particularly led by Egypt, were poised to attack Israel. And this is called the Six-Day War. And Israel, and the goal of the 67 war was to wipe Israel off the map. And so Israel preemptively strikes all of these countries. And in 6 days, this war ends. And what happens is that Israel pushes back the borders and occupies the territories. So the word occupied territory comes from this. It didn't really exist before 1967. So in the south, they occupy the Sinai Peninsula, the whole thing. And they push the border of Israel to the Suez Canal. In the east, they occupy the West Bank and push the border to the Jordan River. And in the kind of northeast, they push into what are called the Golan Heights, which are kind of a hilly area in the north of Israel. And these areas become the occupied territories. Jerusalem, again, is incorporated into Israel, actually, as a whole. And in 1967, Israel declares that Jerusalem is the capital of the country. During this time, Israeli settlements start happening in the Gaza Strip, not so much in the Sinai, but certainly in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights. Also, and we'll talk about the kind of internal uprisings in a minute, but I'm just talking about the external wars. The second war, which was in 1973, which is called the Yom Kippur War, was on Yom Kippur. Those same countries attacked Israel to get the land back that they took. And nothing changed. Israel kind of fought those battles and kept those lines. And so in 1973, nothing in terms of a map changed. And then in 1982, there was a war in Lebanon where Israel based on similar intelligence, saw that there were forces that were going to attack from the north. So Israel, again, preemptively goes into Lebanon and pushes the border and creates like a buffer zone, which still exists today. And so this is an Israeli map, but these rivers here that are going kind of those are where they're kind of like aiming for. And even today, you'll hear these rivers and the valleys to be talked about. But that buffer zone is basically still there. So these are all of the external attacks that are happening and the wars that are happening. At the same time, there's an internal struggle that is often called the intifada. And the intifada in Arabic is like the uprising. And this is an internal uprising against Israel. And so the internal uprisings started in the 1920s and 1930s. But as Israel became more of a nation, they became more kind of coalesced. The largest of the internal groups would have been the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by a guy named Yasser Arafat. He was probably the most identifiable leader during this time. And one of the things that he did to identify himself as a leader is he wore the kafia, and which was the black and white kind of very common, like a scarf that men would wear. And he would wear that, and that scarf became part of the like identity of the Palestinian movement for liberation. You know what I'm talking about? That black and white scarf? Yeah. Okay. So there's uprisings. And the intifadas started in the 1980s. Okay. And these were primarily internal fightings that are happening in Israel. One is in 1987. There were 4 day laborers at a refugee camp in Gaza that were killed, and that set off about 5 years of an uprising where there's an armed conflict between people in Israel and the Israeli government. This is often called the Intifada of stones because there was a lot of stone throwing and things like that. And Israel chose a very harsh response. And during this time is when Hamas was founded. So Hamas is now founded in the late 1980s as a resistance movement. So Hamas is an acronym that stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. And their ideology is based on a similar Arab nationalist movement. So here's from their charter. Here's what they say in their charter. This isn't hard to find. You can find it online pretty easily if you just search for it. So it says, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions in international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Abusing any part of Palestine is abuse directed against part of religion. Nationalism of the Islamic resistance movement is part of its religion. Its members have been fed on that. For the sake of hoisting the banner of Allah over their homeland, they fight. Allah will be prominent, but most people do not know. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. The Palestinian people know better than to consent with having their future, their rights, and their fate toyed with. This is what Hamas has stated in their charter, and it continues to be what they are continuing to kind of be after. So we'll talk about the peace movements in a little, but these groups like Hamas whenever there's been a peace movement, they have been against it. Okay? So there's a second intifada that starts in 2000 and goes to 2005. It was set off when the Israeli prime minister visited the Temple Mount. And this was an area that was under Muslim control. And yet he went up with a lot of different people and military. This second intifada was much more violent and much more radical than the first. There were widespread protests, and during this time is when you would have a lot of bombings. So there would be in bus stations, in pizza places, along the street. It was extremely violent. During this time, in 2001, just in 1 year, 469 Palestinians and 199 Israelis were killed, just in 1 year. And so in Israel, you're seeing just like ongoing violence, and it's just part of the society that's going on. In 2005, at the end of this, Israel completely withdraws from the Gaza Strip. In 2005, at the end of the Second Intifada, Israel believes that the Gaza Strip is no longer governable, and they pull out by force all of the Jewish settlers, and they pull out all of the military. And in 2005, so 10,000 Jewish settlers are removed by the Israeli military. Elections are held, and in 2006, Hamas is elected as the government of Gaza. And from then until now, every year, there were thousands of rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. Every year. And so there had been ongoing conflicts. And so from that time, it's really just been a very challenging situation. Okay, let me talk about the attempts of peace. The first attempt of peace happened in 1979. Jimmy Carter, who recently passed away, had an agreement with the king of Egypt, Sadat, and the prime minister of Israel, and this was known as the Camp David Accords. And Egypt was, in 1979, the first Arab country, even though Egypt might not be Arab, but it's the first Middle Eastern country that formally recognizes Israel's existence. 1979. No other country did until that. And what they did was they gave back all of the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for a lasting peace between Gaza and Israel. And Gaza took over the occupation and management of Gaza, 1979. So 1977, so these are an important couple of little bits of information. In 1977, Sadat speaks at the Knesset, which is the Israeli Congress, first Arab leader to visit Israel, to recognize Israel. In 1978, the Camp David Accords happen, and with this land for peace swap. And in 1981, Sadat is assassinated by Islamic Jihad for his role in the Camp David Accords, and the same year, Israel annexes the Golan Heights and incorporates it into Israel. So, an Arab leader makes peace with Israel. A few years later, that Arab leader is killed by Arab extremists. The next peace deal is called the Oslo Accords. This happens in 1993. Oslo was the second very strong attempt to create peace, and it eventually fell apart. But this was the idea: the idea would be the Gaza Strip would be a completely Palestinian-run area, and the West Bank would have these sort of islands of Palestinian control and Israeli control. And they carved out this whole piece. It was quite a quite a quite a undertaking that they did. Yitzhak Rabin, who is at that point the president of Israel or the prime minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the guy who was the PLO guy, they met in Oslo, worked this out, came to Washington, had a famous handshake, and in Washington, D.C. And it was based on, the agreement was based on this: a mutual recognition of Israel and the PLO, the establishment of a Palestinian Authority to self-govern the West Bank and Gaza, the division of the West Bank into ABC levels of authority, and that was basically what was part, and that the illegal settlements of Israel would be done away with. There was very high hope. This all happened in 1991, and then in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, is assassinated by a Jewish extremist, a Jewish settler named Baruch Goldstein. So the two best options for peace in Israel: one, the Arab leader is killed by an Arab extremist; the other one is the Jewish leader is killed by a Jewish extremist. And so that has brought us to the present day. And this is basically the arrangement of Israel right now. The Gaza Strip is well, pre-October 7th of last year, let's say. The Gaza Strip is completely run and managed by Palestinians, run by Hamas. That's the governing body in the Gaza Strip. The West Bank, there is the Palestinian Authority, which is a Palestinian government, but there's this patchwork of Palestinian towns and Jewish towns and Israeli settlements and legal settlements and illegal settlements and all of these kinds of things. Over the last 20 years, Gaza has been continually launching attacks against Israel. The population has increased exponentially in Gaza. Unemployment is high. People are frustrated. The settler movement has increased. Right now, well, as of, again, let's say before October 7th of last year, there were 127 settlements in the West Bank, 465,000 people living in legal settlements, and 20 to 30,000 in illegal settlements. The settlements are broken up into about a third of them are just secular, and they live there because it's a nice place to live, it's cheaper housing, and things like that. About a third of them are religious, so they're centered in places like Hebron or kind of religious centers, and they're not so much ideologically connected to what's going on in the settlements, but they just want to be close to these religious sites. And then about a third are considered religious Zionists. The guy that killed Yitzhak Rabin was one of these religious Zionists. So they're actively trying to resettle the West Bank and kind of push out some of the Palestinian towns. There we go. So that, in a few minutes, brings us through a little bit of a framework of the history of the conflict that has led us until today. I'll stop there for a question. I know it's a lot of information. I get that.
In the Gaza Strip,
Mhm.
you said that Hamas is in the government.
Right. They were elected.
Do you? I know it's not as black and white as this, but are the Palestinians in agreement with their government and keep electing them, or is it like oppressive?
There was one election in 2006, and that's it.
That's it.
Right.
So they don't have a choice anymore.
Anybody that is critical of the government in Hamas, you won't see them again. So it's a very repressive government. There are Christians in Gaza. There's not many. There are a few that I'm in connection with. There are a couple of evangelical groups in Gaza, and they have continued to function and continued to reach out. They're there now, but it is run by this Hamas, the organization that is committed to a violent resistance. Mm-hmm.
So before all of this happened, Israel basically had a ton of land on it, but then they owned it, but they didn't actually occupy it.
You mean the settlements in the like the West Bank and Gaza?
Like, why did they give up? My question is really, why did they give up the Gaza Strip?
Okay, because there was a hope that there would be a roadmap to peace, which was this land swap. If we give you land, then we will have that in exchange for peace. It has not worked consistently. And so this was the idea of a two-state solution. And so I think the majority of the Israeli population and the majority of the Arab population want this. But you have to realize there's not just like Jews in Israel and Arabs who are Palestinian. There's also kind of a radical element of both groups. And those two radical elements are committed to no peaceful solution. Mm-hmm.
Do we see Jewish radicals in Israeli government?
Yeah. And they're in the government right now. Yeah. But not all. I mean, it's so there's I would say it's a minority in Israel. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, sure. So we have to go back to this one, right? So this was the initial proposal of coming out of the British. So the British have it from 1917 until 1947, and then it was like going to be turned over. And so this was the proposal. The reason why there's red and gray is because the majority of the populations in those areas were Arab, and the majority of the populations here were Jewish. And then this was this was accepted by the UN, accepted by the Jewish Israelis, not accepted by the Palestinians. And then this is what happened a year later after a year of war. And so those two areas, Gaza and the West Bank, have just kind of become, from the beginning, the areas that are part of just the ongoing challenge of existence. So there's always been this question, should they be incorporated in Israel or should they be separate? And I think that if you look at the peace deals and you look at the history, I think Israel has tried on a number of occasions to create autonomous areas, and it hasn't worked for a variety of different reasons. Yeah. Okay, so I'll go back to this. Mm-hmm. Excuse me? No. So it's the Palestinian Authority, the PA. So the Palestinian Authority so if you were an Arab living in the West Bank and you traveled to America, your passport would be Palestinian Authority. And if you're an Arab living in Israel, your passport is Israel. Yeah. So it's the government. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Small. I wish I had like an overlay of like California, but we're kind of talking about, I would say, from the north, the far north of Israel to the far south would be maybe like, I don't know, maybe if you took from like you took the like LA to San Francisco and you cut that in half, and then you cut it in half long ways. It's probably about that size.
How wide is
The Gaza Strip is at its widest, which is here. That is, I think, 7 miles. Yeah. The Gaza Strip? Oh, Israel. Yeah, yeah, probably. Mhm. Okay, so I'm just going to end with this one last slide, which is what happened on October 7th and where things are right now in the War of Gaza. We don't have time to get to the questions or the kind of what to do next, but I do think it's helpful to have like a kind of a historical geography. I think the maps are really helpful for me, at least, to kind of see what's going on. But here's what happened. So on October 7th, 2,000 men entered Israel from Gaza through 29 different breaches in the military barrier. And it was on the last day of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. 1,200 Israelis died, 4,629 injuries, and 251 were taken as prisoners. In response, Israel launches a war on Hamas and Islamic Jihad. These are the two groups in Gaza who both claim responsibility for that attack. As of February 2025, now, 39,000 plus Palestinians have died. The numbers are range and it's honestly, it's very hard to know, but this is kind of a middle range number, just to let you know. 90,000 plus injuries and 1.9 million people were displaced, which is basically the entire population of Gaza. Now, so this is 7 miles here. This is about maybe 30 miles. There are 2 million people that live in that area. It's very densely populated. Of the 250, during that time, just over 1,700 Israelis have died. These are mostly soldiers, and 8,700 were injured. That's both soldiers and people outside of Gaza. Of the 251 hostages, 79 have not been released or rescued. Of those, 35 are believed to no longer be alive. And so throughout 2024, hostility in Israel continued on college campuses. In particular, there were a lot of just a huge amount of protests. Fighting also erupted in the north between Hezbollah, which is another group that's in southern Lebanon. Currently, there's a fragile peace. The war in Lebanon has stopped, and right now we're in the middle of a hostage swap. So 33 hostages from Gaza, mostly women and older men, are being exchanged for 1,700 Palestinian prisoners. So that's kind of where things are right now. And it's kind of a, it's been a very desperate period of time for many, many people. We've all seen lots of pictures. Gaza is just in ruins, and Israeli society is just really challenged. I was there in the summer, this last summer, so it's during the wartime, and just the entire country of Israel that's all Israel is thinking about right now is this war. And lots of people are serving in the military. Lots of our staff are soldiers. Everybody's soldiers in Israel. Everybody serves in the military. So your gap year is the military. Boys serve for 3 years, girls serve for 2, and then you serve in the reserves until you're 50. And everybody in Israel does that. Your reserve duty is kind of based on a variety of things. It's not, it's based on what you were trained to do and things like that. So the war in Gaza has really affected the nation deeply. And so it's I think so that it's too bad we're kind of out of time, but I will say that like the questions that I wanted to go over, I'll just show them to you. So the first question is, does Israel have a right to exist? The second is Israel an apartheid state and therefore responsible for what happened on October 7th? So that like the Palestinians that went into Israel were justified? Oop, out of battery. So there you go. I guess I should stop. The next two questions are: is Israel a colonial state? So is Israel kind of continuing the kind of the British? And it raises the question of what does indigenous mean? Indigeneity. And then the fourth question is criticism of Israel legitimate? Or is it not right to criticize Israel at all? And so those are the 4 questions. They're not the only questions that people are asking, but I do think they are 4 important ones and maybe some really kind of key ones. So I know it's heavy. I want this to be helpful. I want this to be something that gives you some handles, but it's time to now stop, right? We have another session afterwards. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take the first little bit if there's some lingering questions, and then we'll finish up then. Yep.